Hello there. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for your patience. My name is Mafalda, and today I'm going to continue the conversation that I started in the last video around the topic of trauma. And my intention is that this will become a foundational series right at the start of the channel that you can refer back to if you'd like to review some of the information around the topic of trauma. That way it's labeled and it's also concentrated as, like I said, a foundational series. So for that matter, I will be using my intellectual abilities, my logic, the rational side of my brain. This is purely information, purely educational. And so that's a bit of a disclaimer. I just want to put that out there. This type of content is for those of us who are interested in knowledge, who enjoy understanding at an intellectual level. However, it is purely educational. So watching these videos and understanding these concepts at a mental level does not mean that you will have healed from trauma. It is purely for educational purposes. Also, because healing happens at a holistic level. It cannot happen simply at one level of existence, and in this case, the intellectual or the mental plane of existence. This is just for those of us who enjoy this type of content, who like to dive deep into things, who like to use their rational minds, not identify with the mind, but put it to good use, utilize it for what it's good at, which is to reflect and to categorize and to analyze. And another reason why I am sharing this information in this fashion is that me being somebody who enjoys intellectual content, it did help me on my own healing journey to become aware of exactly what was going on in my brain as I was healing from trauma and also as I was experiencing the symptoms of trauma. And it did help me feel less alone, more understood, because one of the consequences of living with trauma is that you might end up blaming yourself and feeling like there's something wrong with you. Your nervous system, your brain doesn't function like other people's. And so when I learned about exactly why I was experiencing these symptoms and exactly what was happening, it made me realize that, in fact, there was nothing wrong with me, that my system was designed to have these reactions. It was just trying to wake me up to something that had occurred that was very real. And so there was nothing wrong with me. I was just experiencing the natural consequences of having undergone a series of traumatic events. So if you're like me, this information may provide some sort of relief in that way. However, it does not substitute therapy, coaching. It does not substitute the wide range of modalities that you can use to heal from trauma. And in the next, maybe not the next one, but the one after that, the next video, in one of the next videos, I will be going into how we heal from trauma and exactly what tools we have available to us to do so. Okay, now that the disclaimer is out of the way, I do have some notes here, by the way, because I do want to make sure that I reference everybody's work correctly and that this is really credible information. We live in an era of information, of course, and it's great. We have the internet, we have access to information, but that also comes with its shadow side, which is misinformation. And so we have access to all this variety of information, but not always is it grounded in truth. And so it is important to me, since this is not direct experience, this is not wisdom that's coming from my direct experience, it's coming from things that I have learned, that I want to reference them appropriately. And that might also be my academic background coming in there. So I mentioned in one of my latest videos that Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is one of the leading neuroscientists in the field of trauma. And his work, his book, The Body Keeps the Score, was sort of my Bible when I was deep diving into my own trauma. And that it really helped me, again, because I'm interested in science and I'm interested in how the brain and the universe works. But I will be referencing a lot of his work today in this video. Okay, so from a neuroscientific perspective, what happens is that when a stressful event is done, it's over, then it's over. With trauma, that's not really the case. That's not what happens. The body somehow keeps reliving the event. So living with trauma is akin to being unconsciously, or it literally is being unconsciously stuck in the past. So the body and the mind are reliving the event, even though the event is over. So that's the key difference between distress, just stress that you might experience every day. This world is challenging or can be challenging, and trauma, where the event, it's almost like the event does not end. So there is fundamentally a change, a long-lasting change to our brain and our nervous system. And that is why when we look at the brain scans of somebody that has experienced trauma and of somebody that has not experienced trauma, they are different. Different areas of the brain are fired up in the face of the same stimuli or trigger. So going back to the definition of trauma, according to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, is an event or a series of events that were so overwhelming that they caused a collapse in the system. So you collapsed in somewhat of a state of rage, confusion, but there's a sense of impotence and there's a sense of not being able to stave off the inevitable, in Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's words. So this threat, this particular threat, feels like too much to handle. There's an overwhelm to the system and the nervous system cannot cope. So what may happen is that the left side of our brain, the rational part of our brain, may completely shut down. And the right side of our brain, which is the abstract side of our brain, may remain on. And that is why the imprints of trauma may be stored in the form of sensations, sounds, smells, but not linear, time-bound narratives or stories or even images. Okay? So trauma starts off as something that happens to you, but then ultimately changes your brain. So when we look at trauma, trauma is not the event itself that happened, it's the response that your brain and your body had to, and your soul, in fact, but we'll get to that, had to that event. So it's the imprint of the event. That means that trauma can be what? It can be subjective. So what might be traumatic for one person might not be for somebody else. Which leads me to talk about one of the mitigating factors, and this is again according to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's research. One of the mitigating factors of developing trauma is the quality of the support system you have while you're experiencing a traumatic event or in the aftermath of a traumatic event. If you have people that love you, that care for you, that are there for you while this is happening, the chances that you will develop trauma, i.e. that your brain will be literally changed and altered by that event, decreases significantly, because we are wired for connection. We are interconnected beings. We need one another. So take the example of a child, or whatever example, actually, if you want to take something really shocking, traumatic happens. If somebody's there for you, if somebody holds you, if somebody makes you feel like it's okay, if somebody holds space for your emotions, if somebody offers you the sense of belonging and of safety that you need to feel like you have what it takes to get through it, then that memory will be a memory of feeling supported as opposed to more of a traumatic memory. That's the power that community, that support, and that our interconnectedness has. That's how powerful it is. And that's why healing from trauma often, especially if you're talking about severe trauma, healing from trauma will most likely always require some form of co-regulation, some form of you experiencing love from another human, looking into that person's eyes and feeling trust, experiencing trust again, because that's what's going to build the resilience to get through the process of bringing your nervous system back to its natural baseline, which is a state of ease, a state of relaxation, not a state of tension or being constantly fired up. But I will get into more of how to heal trauma in the next few videos. But I just wanted to mention that because it is something that Dr. Bessel van der Kolk really points to. He really flags that. So I wanted to bring it in. So in terms of how the trauma is actually stored in the brain, the imprint of trauma is stored then in the most primitive part of our brain, which actually resides here at the back of the head, at the top of the neck. And Dr. Bessel van der Kolk calls it the cockroach brain, but I've seen it referred to as the reptilian brain a lot. But basically, it's the primitive part of our brain. It's the part of our brain that we share with reptiles, basically. And it is responsible for our threat perception, our perception of threat and our response to threat, and also our survival mechanism. And so that's where it's held. And what happens is that there's a damage that occurs to that part of the brain. There's an imprint, and it can also be referred to as an injury of fright. So what happens is that part of our brain becomes overactive, and it starts, if you do have trauma, what it'll start to do is it'll start to set off the alarm bell in everyday situations when actually it's not, the situation that's being presented does not justify your danger response to be activated in that way. So basically, although the original event itself, it's over, the primitive part of your brain is reacting to everyday life situations as if the event is still taking place, as if your life is still in danger. And in fact, I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, but that's a key component of trauma. There's a life or death. We're talking about life or death situations. Like, this is the level of survival mechanism that gets triggered when we hold trauma in the system. And so a certain trigger in your everyday life, it could be a sound, a smell, a phrase, a tone, a situation, might set off your survival response. So your nervous system will either go into fight or flight, or at a more primitive level, it'll go into freeze, where there's a total shutdown and collapse. And here I want to make note, just a quick side note, I've seen it referred to as fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, but it is important to reference that fawn is not a survival mechanism or a survival response. Fawn is a learned response. Over time, if you're consistently going into freeze, if your nervous system is continuously activated and your threat response is continuously being activated, what might happen is that you develop a learned response called fawn, where it's the people pleasing, but that's over time. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that, because people tend to include the fawn response as though it's like a primitive response, when it's not. It's learned. It absolutely occurs, but it's learned. So basically, what's happening is the person that holds trauma is trying to stay alive in the face of a threat that is not actually the product of your assessment of your present moment, your cognitive assessment, the left side of your brain or your prefrontal cortex, looking at a situation and saying, okay, there's danger here. It's not that you're in the jungle and suddenly you see a lion running after you, okay, and you assessed that this situation is dangerous and therefore you need to go into fight or flight to protect yourself and to defend your life. No, it's not coming from there. It's coming from this damage to the animal part of your brain that's perceiving a threat that is not there. So it's firing up your adrenaline, your cortisol, your stress hormones to respond to this threat, even though you are not actually in the face of a life threat. And it'll start doing it, like I said, it'll be overactive. So it'll happen a lot. And over time, what that does is that also creates issues, immunological issues and endocrine abnormalities, right? That's where you go into adrenal fatigue, because your body's pumping up so much cortisol. So basically, that's where we see that trauma really impacts our physical health over time. And survivors of trauma are much more likely to carry a number of diseases in their bodies due to this reason. And in fact, this is something that we've learned also from Dr. Gabor Mate's work. And who else? Well, others, Bruce Lipton, there's other thinkers and practitioners out there that have shed light on this specific matter. And in fact, if you think about it, stress is basically the number one cause of disease, because stress inhibits the immune system. And the proof of that is that basically when you go in for a transplant, an organ transplant, what do doctors inject into you? They inject stress hormones into you so that the immune system will stop working, will not fire up, it'll not respond properly to or how it's wired to, how it's meant to this foreign object that you're putting inside of your body, so that it doesn't respond. They inject stress hormones into you. So that's how effective stress hormones are in blocking your immune system. Okay? So yes, absolutely, trauma affects our physical health, and you might have all kinds of issues, chronic pain, et cetera, et cetera. And I will be going into this in more depth in terms of my personal experience and what it's like to live with trauma, and more direct experience. So don't worry, if you're interested in these topics, do let me know. If you have any questions, by the way, now that I think about it, if you do have any questions about anything that I've mentioned so far, do let me know in the comments and I'll address them specifically. Also, if you're interested in finding out exactly what parts of the brain are responsible for what functions, I can go into that as well. It just depends on whether you're interested or not. Like, I love this stuff, but I also know that this is absolutely not essential to heal from trauma. Absolutely not. So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh my God, this sounds like gibberish to me, don't worry. There will be also other types of content that will be more practical and that'll help you. This is, like I mentioned, for those of us who are interested in this sort of discussion. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention when it comes to a more medical perspective or view on trauma has to do with the suppression of emotions. And we also know a lot about that through the work of Dr. Gabor Mate. So he's also quite well known and has contributed significantly to the field. So I really appreciate the work that's being done and that's being shared and how accessible it is for us today. So what happens is that, we'll create certain limiting belief patterns and also emotions that stem from the original trauma. Because think of it, right? Your nervous system's getting fired up on a daily basis in response to threats that basically don't exist. So you're going to accumulate stored emotions. Also, because the nervous system is not working properly, it's not processing those emotions properly. And what we know is that emotions are energy in motion. And we also know that energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transmuted. So if your nervous system is not processing those emotions that come up in response to these supposed life threats, they're getting stuck. They're becoming trapped in your body, in your energy field. Okay? And so over time, you will want to numb your emotions, because who on earth wants to feel that amount of stored emotions that stem back to I don't know how many years that you've lived with trauma. So what we do is we try to numb, and we find all kinds of coping mechanisms to not have to feel this pain. And this becomes a vicious cycle. And that's when we talk about re-traumatization. And that's also why a lot of people with trauma tend to repeat certain behaviors compulsively. And yeah, so we try to numb those emotions. And yeah, we know about this through Dr. Gabor Mate's work. So if you're interested in that, do go research more into this relationship between the stored emotions and the numbing and the coping mechanisms, because Dr. Gabor Mate is a specialist in addiction. But there's something that wants to come through, and this is not necessarily from either Dr. Bessel van der Kolk or Dr. Gabor Mate, right? But it's, yes. So last thing I want to say in terms of how trauma shapes our brain and how it affects us is that, because obviously your nervous system will start to work on or run on overdrive because it's getting fired, your survival mechanism is getting fired up on a daily basis, and it's on operating on overdrive. What'll happen is you're going to be so used to experiencing adrenaline and cortisol that when you're not experiencing that, you'll feel numb and you won't feel anything, and it feels like you're not alive. And that's why a lot of people with trauma will chase for these experiences. They'll become adrenaline junkies and do, highly dangerous sports or activities, or even become re-traumatized, repeat the traumatic event, because you sort of need that hit of adrenaline or cortisol to feel alive again. You almost don't know what it's like to live in peace. Well, you don't, because you're so used to living in chaos. That's your standard. That's your baseline. And that's why, and I'll finish off here, that's why regulating the nervous system is basically the key to healing from trauma. And it's also the key to handle awakening, spiritual awakening as well. And we'll see why in the next video when I talk about the spiritual and shamanic perspective on healing from trauma. But yes. Okay, so I think I'll leave it at that. I hope that this information is useful to you. Again, if there's any questions that you have, do let me know. And yeah, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. And also let me know if there's anything that resonated with you. I really look forward to keep diving deep and really dissecting these topics. Hopefully, I'll also get to sharing a bit more of my direct experience and just my opinions, and not opinions in a polarized way, but the wisdom that I've gathered. Yes, I think that's a better way to put it. The wisdom that I've gathered along my journey and my perspective, my unique insight due to the trauma that I've survived, that I've transmuted, and also all that I have come to know about reality and how our brains, our minds, our bodies, and our souls work. All right. Thank you so much. I really do hope that you enjoyed, and I wish you a rest of a lovely day. See you very, very soon on here again.